Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Marisa Parham, Professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, on the show. So, Dr. Parham is the PI of the African American Digital and Experimental Humanities Initiative and NARA Space, an immersive scholarly storytelling lab focused on queer, BIPOC, and migratory experiences. She is also Associate Director for the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities and holds affiliate faculty appointments in African American and Africana Studies, the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the program in Immersive Media and Design, and in the program in Comparative Literature. Dr. Parham's current teaching and research projects focus on tech and technologies that problematize assumptions about time, space, and bodily materiality. She is particularly interested in how such terms share histories of increasing complexity in literary and cultural texts produced by African Americans, and how this connection enables experimental approaches to digital humanities, electronic narrative, and technology studies. Recent examples of this work include Sample Signal Strobe, Haunting Social Media and Black Digitality, and the long-form digital interactive scholarly essay, Break, Dance, which is also anthologized in the Electronic Literature Collection and was a 2021 honorable mention for the N. Catherine Hales Award from the Electronic Literature Organization and has been featured in an exhibit at the Next in 2024. She is currently at work on the Black Haints Project, a book-length digital interactive narrative concerning memory, digitality, and environmental experience, Convocation AR, an XR-driven humanities computing project, and Black Digitalities, a book that seeks to broaden understandings of the digital turn by centering Black digital technique across expressive registers. In 2024, Dr. Parham received a Graduate Faculty Mentor of the Year award from University of Maryland. Dr. Parham holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University and is the author of Haunting and Displacement in African American Literature and Culture, the Princeton Review's African American Student's Guide to College, co-editor with John Drabinsky of Theorizing Glissant, Cites and Citations, and the author, designer, and programmer for numerous other essays, journal issues, crowdsourced arts experiments, and digital projects. Recent projects include Unhurried Witness, a Black feminist life world project designed in collaboration with Curation by Serene Sensei, Material Conditions, '01, co-curated with Cassandra Hadral, and Andrew W. Smith for the 2022 Wrong Biennial, and a 2-issue Black DH edition of the journal Reviews in DH, co-edited with Aaliyah Brown and Trevor Munez. Dr. Parham also co-directs the Immersive Realities Lab for the Humanities and currently chairs the ACLS Commission on Fostering and Sustaining Diverse Digital Scholarship. For 2022 to 2025, Dr. Parham also serves as UMD Leader in Residence for the Breaking Mold Initiative, which aims to develop a diverse set of leaders shaped by arts and humanities scholarly values and distinct skills. Prior to coming to UMD, she was the Professor of English and Faculty Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Amherst College and a former director of the 5 College Digital Humanities. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Marisa Parham, Professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. How are you doing today, Dr. Parham?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you so much for being here,
I'm
for making
excited.
the time to talk with us. So I will dive in. How did you get into Black Studies as a field?
Yeah, it's funny because thinking about that question and like the question of fields or whatever, which I'll say a little bit more about probably in a second, but at the level of just sort of interest in departments, I just sort of fell into it. I grew up in a family with, a grandfather, for instance, who graduated from high school, which is a big deal, and just love collecting books that were like books about, now I recognize them as books about Black thought. At the time, they were just like Black books. They're sort of everywhere. And because I was a reader, even at a young age, he would feed me just all these different kinds of books now that I know is Black studies books. But again, they're just books. So I read like Black Metropolis, right? For example, a lot of Richard Wright, and just, he has stuff like the Black Book, which I still teach, edited by Toni Morrison, sort of big volume. And so just sort of ingesting those and just thinking in many ways that that's just what books were. So it's a way of saying, like, yes, it was, like, Black studies and, like, Black thought, but because I grew up in a family, or that's part of my family, that was just so much about, like, activism, like, we also spent, many a weekend pounding the pavement with petitions, so for me, it was just, like, in the water. I didn't really thematize it or think about it very much. Even now, I still kinda struggle with thematize it. I'm just like, "Yeah, okay." This is what we did. And then when I got to college, I didn't major in Black studies, but I decided it was the place for me to be, so I wandered in, like, my first semester and got a job in the, AFAM department, right? So that's where I worked for 4 years. So again, it was, like, kinda thing I was like, "This is what we do," right?
Mhm.
And then I look up and, like, if I were to look back, at some point, as a double major, it was something else, political economy and English, and at some point, I realized I could, like, petition because I'd taken so many classes that were technically Black studies classes. I should have been a major, but I did a minor, um, instead, and also I focused on African languages, so even that was, like, a complex sort of thing, right? And so I think also that moment, this is Washington University, having the opportunity to sort of that's probably when I first started thinking about Black studies in terms of field, actually, was when I started doing African studies, because it helps sort of mark out the similarities and differences in ways that, like, it just drew some distinctions for me.
Mhm.
They were different than, like, Black studies or Black writing versus 19th century English writing, or, like, it just gave me some sense of, like, interior division in a way. Not division, but difference that this was really important for me. Um, and I think, yeah. So that's a bad answer. I don't have, like, a fancy story of, like, I majored and my eyes were open. It was just, like, what we did and what I did. And even when I was doing other things, I was still doing that, but I never quite thematized it 'cause I just thought that's what I was supposed to be doing, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and yeah, I can relate to that. My mother had Black books, like, they were just there, so it
Yeah.
was always a thing before I knew that Black studies was a field.
Mhm.
So what keeps you committed to Black studies now?
I just think opportunity, to be honest. Well, it's 2 things. I mean, it's opportunity and as an opportunity, like, to grow and change and transform, 'cause I think
Mhm,
transformation, I should be clear, is so much a part of Black studies and Black thought. I just find that deeply appealing, right? It's just, again, sort of baked into how I think about scholarship and intellectualism. But also, I do think as I got later in graduate school, and even for my first job or my first tenure track job, um, I did begin to have a feeling of obligation that I had to do it. Because again, my previous experience was, like, growing up in Black communities with Black stuff all the time, and then going to college and working in a Black department, so it was just again
mhm,
and I think I was actually just very lucky and didn't know it, because I just assumed everywhere was like that. And then I end up in a graduate school that doesn't even have a department or doesn't even and I was like, "What?" Like, "What's happening?" You know? I worked at I taught at Hunter College as an adjunct for years, and I'm like, "What?" So I'm going, "What?" Right? And that's when I realized, "Oh, shit," like, I've been living with a lot of, like, I'm grateful, a lot of Black privilege, but what does it mean that so many other people don't get this kind of exposure or don't get to take these things for granted?
mhm,
So a big part, I would say my degree, I mean, is technically composite history and actually the theory of literary theory. So I would say I'm definitely part of the problem. So theorizing literary theory, which gives you a lot of European, a lot of global, a lot of
mhm,
whatever. And then once I realized that, Black thinking is also an important part of that conversation. Right. And these people are all reading each other. That's the other thing. I think I'm going a little bit astray, but I find my students very often will be talking about like temporality and Du Bois and Harper or something, Francis Harper. And I'll start talking about Einstein, which the students like, but they're like, why are we doing Einstein? I'm like, it's the same time period. Right? And
mhm,
we absolutely know Einstein was paying attention. We absolutely know Du Bois was paying attention to Einstein. We actually know. So there's a way in which a lot of it gets lost this is the difficulty why I struggle. When I sometimes say I really struggle with disciplination in fields, this is why I struggle with it. Because when you start defining the field, it's so easy for these connections to fall away.
Mhm.
And how do you even dig within the self for the diligence, to do sort of almost double the work sometimes to keep the connections alive.
Mhm.
But once I realized that I could sort of talk about all kinds of things, I do a lot of memory studies. I was really interested, like as a subfield, my major subfields in graduate school was Holocaust studies. And just realizing, again, that histories of Black intellectual thought had so much to say about these things, or contribute so much to those conversations, or even just recast the conversations. And then also those conversations can come the other way, right?
Mhm.
When I was working in a graduate degree in the 90s, I was always kind of at that moment interested in the ways, for instance, like trauma theory had and had not really entered Black studies, for instance. You see what I mean? So there's a way in which
Mhm.
conversations can go in more than one direction. And so I just made it my job so that every class I teach is essentially a Black studies class no matter what it is, at some point, because I can actually use these materials no matter what the subject matter is. Not always, but in most cases, and make it a lot of materials and make sure that not at the level of inclusion like texts about Black life, but really formulating, for instance, syllabi in a way that clarify the importance of Black intellectualism, like voices of commentary in relation to things, not just objects of study. It's really that's part of the theory, right? It's really important to recast that sometimes,
Mhm.
right? And so I think the commitment really comes from with that, just making sure that we're producing more people, more students, more academics, more community leaders, more school principals, right? More English, high school English teachers, middle school teachers who have a comfort and organic sense of integration versus only thinking about a kind of inclusion because it's something they have to get done.
Mhm.
Even Black people can fall into. We have jobs that have to get done sometimes, to be
Mhm.
clear, right? And so how to really develop a sense of organic relationship to Black materials and making sure also to continue teaching and calling it Black studies because we just need people doing it, like bodies in the room. And I need to be a body in the room in a certain way, and I'm okay with that. I don't even know if I answered the question, but
You absolutely answered the question and had several points that lead themselves to the next 2 questions. Um, but because you ended on, like, showing students the interrelationships between these ideas in the classroom, how do you feel or do you wanna elaborate on, because you kinda answered that, how your work as a teacher and your, like, pedagogical toolkit is informed by the field of Black studies?
yeah, I think at the level of form, it's just always really being ready to engage and thematize and demonstrate, and at the level of skills, teach a sense of multidisciplinarity,
Mhm.
um, and also interdisciplinarity, but I tend to focus on kind of so thinking about disciplines are sitting next to each other, not always these full integrations. I think there's a real danger in that I've discovered over time, which we can say more about at some point. But, in class, just making sure that one, in the level of syllabus, that students have multiple entry points to thinking about Black life. And also, again, making sure so if I'm teaching, my class on environmental memory in the Americas, right? Um, Making sure that, numerous of those texts are also Black Caribbean, Black South American, Black American, and making sure to really, again, thematize things at the level of form, not just the level of inclusion, like saying, "Well, this is it's really easy in that kind of class, like, this is a Black text, this is an Indigenous text, this is this," right? And so as much as possible, creating assignments, for example, that really force students to form, again, sort of organic interrelations between texts, and making sure that they're also doing that with the Black text, which sounds weird, but I do think I should be clear that I think the way that Black writing has come into syllabi at the level of thinking about, things are to get done for diversity, et cetera, is actually different in some
Mhm.
ways than other kinds of literatures and texts. I should be clear. That's why I keep saying it that way. Um, so for instance, I do think it might be changing now and not necessarily for the best, where for a long time, if you were someone who was also teaching Latinx or indigenous texts, you were someone who was very likely also studying those things and really caring about those things.
Mhm.
Whereas and you're like, "Oh, and also I need something Black." Right? And that's why I think, again, that's changing a little bit now. People are like, "And you need something indigenous." You're like, "No, it doesn't work that way." But you see. So that's why I say it that way. That's also me maybe dating myself, but that's what I saw, for years with that. And so, yeah. And so I think the big thing is, again, those organic relationships. So if I teach a class, as I do, for instance, on digital storytelling, at some point, this computer science student might look up and say, like, "Oh my god, almost all the electronic literature we're looking at, has been by Black creators." But I won't necessarily say it, right? P
Mhm.
So I won't necessarily say that, right? Um, when a student looks up and realizes in digital storytelling that so many of the materials are by Black creators, right? In those moments, I just kinda shrug. I'm like, "Yeah." Right? We be making stuff, like, and so I did kind of intentionally, obviously, but actually making sure there are always those moments. And I know this is very kind of structural responses, but I think this is where it's at is implementation. It's just
Mhm.
how it work. And also just with that as well, making sure that unless there's a real like thematic or conceptual point to be made, also making sure that the text by Black creators, and Black intellectuals. One, the intellectuals get to comment on all kinds of things, not just other Black people. Again,
Mhm.
pairing those, like, how do we think about double consciousness and relativity together? How do we think about Marx in relation to Harper, blah, 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 right? Um, but also making sure that Black texts are never isolated, right? They're spread throughout the syllabus. They're not only there to be Black, they're there to do something else structural.
Mhm.
That's something that's about plot or about form or about, um, some form of coding because we do that in courses, right? That kind of thing. So, yeah.
I think that's such an important point, like, not having the Black text be there just to be the Black text, but to really think about how it is providing space or response or just general knowledge,
Mm,
right? Without situating it as such, which I think is it speaks to the ways in which Black studies or the study of Black people has been integrated in a lot of the academy. Like making
mhm,
sure that like having it isolated and not taking it seriously beyond being the Black text
mhm,
or the Black course, right?
mhm.
So I think that's such an important point to make, and reminder or just general idea that gets lost,
Yeah.
particularly when it's tied to the DEI, like, when it's tied to, like, this course covers a diversity credit, which means that it's gotta include these certain things.
Mhm,
um, and what the DEI guidelines look like for that inclusion rather than mandating that it takes seriously this thought across spaces.
mhm, mhm. No, I think that's really well put. And, like, again, I understand why we do these things, right? Like, so why we have requirements and why you do have to move students. And for me personally, so much of what I'm interested in actually came out of required courses I didn't want to take. There's
Mhm.
some humility. I was like, "Blah, blah, blah." I rolled. I'm like, I meant to say, I love the history of science, right? So, so I just really believe in that experience, but we kinda cheapen it when we sort of articulate it as a sort of like, credit you have to require. Right, and that we
Mhm.
make it even like a credit and not even a form of capital. So one thing I talk about in my classes, 'cause I talk about this a little bit, because again, I'm getting so many students who are often there for that credit, and I talk about the difference between gaining it's all unfortunately economic, but that's also my background, political economy, that, you know, they're being asked to acquire a credit rather than even develop capital, like social capital,
Mhm.
right, or intellectual capital to grow. To
Yeah.
accumulate, for better or for worse, I'm just putting it that way because it's easy to say credit and capital in that
Mhm.
setting, when we're talking about it, to be clear, and really getting to sort of think about that and how it actually takes a personal commitment to never letting that happen. 'Cause say once you have a personal commitment to the accumulation of knowledge, the accumulation of experience, the accumulation of all these things, and you leave behind the credit narrative, you can grow so much from any of these opportunities. But as long as you leave yourselves locked into this credit mentality, nothing will ever satisfy you because it's fundamentally unsatisfying,
Yeah.
right? And so really thematizing that, because again, part of teaching, for instance, a good number of computer science students or even engineering students, and I'm really at Maryland, um, I take this very seriously, that when they're in your class, your humanities class, right, this is only this is one of only 3 electives they get to take. So the stakes are so different also.
Mhm.
And I think that's been difficult, segueing a little bit, but I think that's been difficult sometimes for humanities people to always understand when we're getting to quote STEM students, et cetera, that the constraints they're actually under, are just so vastly different. The way school looks to them is so different from
Mhm.
how it looks to a humanities student, and we actually have to accommodate that because not of their own making. They're in a program,
Yeah.
right? It's not like they chose this, and there are programs at many institutions, particularly for STEM, that they can be kicked out of.
Yeah.
That's something else we don't think about. You don't think about someone, and I think in good ways, in Black studies or English saying like, "Oh, you're not gonna major in this anymore." That's not a thing,
No.
right? But in engineering and it actually is a thing. And so how to, like, even give students a sense of fortitude, right? And a feeling of control and agency in that, because their agency, no matter who they are, is actually critically important to the work of Black studies and the work of diversity more generally, because it will not work if they do not take it seriously. They can only
Mhm.
take it seriously by seeing its value to themselves at a level that exists over and outside the things they have to get done for school, which is only a very small part of their lives ultimately. Sorry, I get all strident. It happens.
And that is another really important reminder. Like, there are a lot of constraints on students in certain majors. And I think it also speaks to sometimes the ways in which students can approach classes that are more in the humanities, the credit that you have to get for it, right? And because they have those constraints and because they are at risk of not staying in their program,
Mhm.
yeah. Like, I'm just thinking about how I have thought about students who are very concerned with, like, grades and, like, the credit that they're getting for this particular course, and how that should be negotiated maybe differently in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
So, that's really yeah. I don't think I have as many, like, comp sci students as you do here, but, when I was at Stanford, I had a lot of engineering students because most students there were
Mhm.
engineering students.
Mhm.
And it was very much like, yeah, I've gotta take a Rec Comp course, but I need to get an A because if I don't get an A, then I'm at risk.
Yeah.
Um, but they have to have the but then yeah, just the negotiation between not letting it be transactional, but also not feeling like students don't care because
Right.
this is a transaction for them.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's just sorry, that's a lot.
No, it is, and it's bad for us. Like,
Yeah.
I say these things, but to be clear, I don't say this in the spirit of, like, we're compromising, our values are compromising. It's just really thinking from the start about the dynamics,
Mhm.
right? And thinking of how to, like, speak to that.
Yeah.
Even if you make them do something different, you have to speak to it. You can't not acknowledge it.
Mhm.
And you're just doing to them what you're accusing them of doing to you, right? At some level. Frankly, just saying they're adults. And we kind of forget that sometimes, right? Like, would you really take that? Just saying. You know?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So in earlier in your response, you talked about the multidisciplinary versus interdisciplinary and the potential problems with integration of the disciplines. But how do you situate yourself in relationship to disciplines? And then if you want to say more about the multidisciplinary versus interdisciplinary as well.
Yeah. I think what I'm thinking, well, for myself in relation to disciplines, I've always had a strong sense of disciplines because I was trained and always majored in things that were kind of far apart from each other. That's probably has me thinking about all this all the time. Like being in like econ, political economy, even political theory versus like English, right?
Mhm.
Or African studies are just different worlds. They're actually just different worlds at the level of structure. The
Mhm.
idea is cross, this is interdisciplinarity, but the level of structure, they're different. Right, and so this is the moment, I think at some point earlier, prior to our conversation, we were talking a little bit about this. It was when I started giving more talks to people in engineering and comp sci and realized they had literally no way to click into me reading a paper for 35 minutes. It just
Mhm.
isn't on the table as a thing, as a form. And I'm so generous with that also. 'Cause I'm not sure it's on the table as a form for a whole lot of people, but in humanity, we're going to pretend and nod and survive, you know, sometimes. So I've been thinking about that a lot, which is a little too glib, but I have been thinking about it myself. As a long-winded person, I have to think about it, frankly, being careful. But so when I learned I had to give papers differently because the level of structure and interpretation and even the reason for existing was actually just different. Not better or worse, just different.
Mhm.
And if we're gonna talk about difference and want to be taken seriously in difference, then we have to acknowledge difference is a difference. It's different sometimes. It's hard,
Yeah.
right? And so I've always been that's one thing. And the other thing is I actually care deeply, and I get in trouble for this maybe in my mind I'm worried I get in trouble about it. Who knows what's actually happening? Who's paying attention? But I deeply believe in disciplinary knowledge,
Mhm.
frankly. But that's only because of my own experiences where the disciplines require skills. Because skills has been such a dirty word in academia. I think it's been part of the problem why we don't talk about directly, whereas I think very directly about skills and skill sets.
Mhm.
Again, if we go back to African studies, AFAM, or African American studies, which is what I did, at some point, it's language. You have to learn a language. You have to learn the language. I'm complet language. I don't care how you feel. You gotta learn the words. You gotta memorize some words. You see them getting at, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not really I won't say it's objective as if it were like all, was objective anyway, but there's a thing there you need. And now, because I do so much literacy and poetry and talking about all these things through code, right, through computer coding, at some point, it's a skill.
Yeah.
You actually need a knowledge base. And I think there are a lot of things like that, right? There's been always the issue. I'm not in it and I struggled with it for a long time and I still do. That's fine. I'm human. But when you talk to, certain sectors, for instance, of historians who think their job is to be much closer to an empirical scientist than it is to humanities, right? I take issue with, I have personally, I think I can make an argument, political argument, all the things. But if I'm just swinging to a perspective in the ways they think about evidence, the way they think about all those things, that's just a thing. And for them, it's a training. And like they need to use their training. Let's train them, right? So on the one hand, it evinces sort of the danger of disciplination, but also it's real value. There's a way to do things. And I think that if you don't have a grounding in discipline, you lose sight. It's actually easy to lose sight of why you care about something. Right. So I spend a lot of time talking about things outside. When I'm talking about music, I spend my joke. It's not even a joke. It's just sad, I guess. Like I spend a lot of time talking about music with no musical training. I'm not even quite sure. I'm like, is that like a note or like a tone? Like, and like, it's so like, and I think it's okay for the work I do for me to do that. But I also have to be comfortable acknowledging what I don't know.
Mhm.
And then if I were to do a certain kind of work that went much farther than I'm going, if I was trying to really make like a really strong theoretical point about a musical thing, I need help. Right? And it's a skill set that's at a depth that I can't acquire like in a semester of reading. I can't go read a book and know it.
Yeah.
Right? And so to me, interdisciplinarity is when you produce structures that enable conversations between people who have authentically different methodologies, approaches, and skill sets, right? I struggle a bit with when we call things interdiscipline within the same world. Like, I'm just not convinced that, like, if you're in Black studies, I'm in English, we're working together as interdisciplinary.
Mhm.
There's a way in which we're using a lot of the same techniques, modalities, texts. We know how we talk, right? But when you put, and I've worked in these groups before, when you put computer scientists or electrical engineers in a room with a poetry person, even what's supposed to count as a conversation has to be established as a ground rule. What
Mhm.
counts as a conversation to electrical engineer is very different than what counts as a conversation or what matters as a conversation to, I hate doing this going too far, but like a poet, right? Um, and so a lot of the work of interdisciplinarity isn't people trying to learn lots of little bits of a lot of things to make some big points. It's really about how you get people with, a formidable amount of training into the same room who are enabled to figure out how each other thinks and to draw from that. right? It's really hard. I heard a story recently, I'm not going into detail in the institution, of someone who's, someone in a humanities discipline in a classroom with a comp sci person, and they had both some reason agreed to not listen to each other's lectures. They're just trading off the week to week of the class, for example. Like, "Well, I'm here to do this," and the other person, "Well, I'm here to do this." Right? I'm like, "No, you can't actually do that. That's not interdisciplinary. It's like y'all both just showing up," right? But the reason they did it that way is because they felt, and again, there's pressures here around, timing of courses and semesters. To be clear, humans under constraint, was that it was just too hard. It was easy for them to figure out what they could contribute to the topic from their perspectives,
Yeah.
but, it could be a semester or summer, maybe more worth of work of working together, like in a reading group or something, to be able to talk enough to get in front of students. So for me, that's some of the stuff around discipline, interdisciplinarity. Multidisciplinary is really, it's drawing a fine distinction, but it's what I do. Um, of really thinking about training yourself, because I've had to do this in different disciplines. Right. If I'm doing some computer coding, I have to train myself in that and say that I do that. If I'm gonna do something in, prosody and poetry, I have to train myself in doing that, right?
Mhm.
In a classroom or in writing, I can call upon those skill sets. To me, that's multidisciplinarity, right? So again, for me, interdisciplinarity is an imagination, even within the self, of bringing different conversations with some authority into a room. Right? Even if things yourself, right? At some level. And multidisciplinarity is really about the sort of work that it takes to produce objects, produce knowledge, to teach, um, from those different perspectives, from the different fields, and to be able to thematize the differences as you're doing it, right? Because students have to be able to hear it and to know it as well,
Mhm.
because they don't really care about discipline at all, and I don't think they need to. I
Yeah.
think they're there to enjoy it and learn, and you see what I'm getting at? But doing some historical or formal differences, I think they just find fascinating, frankly, and also helps them make better decisions, right? How you get the double major.
Yeah.
If I'm being
No,
more
that
if I'm being more honest. Sorry.
great. Great. Like, this is yeah. Like, why would a student double major if they don't understand the differences and
Mhm.
the importance of developing a skill set in multiple spaces
Yeah.
rather than being in a classroom where things are kind of can seem to just be thrown together or blend over.
Mhm.
That also speaks to, like, pedagogy and what collaboration in the classroom looks like too, because you
Mhm.
are bringing in students from across multiple disciplines where they're being trained in different ways, and what does it look like to bring them together to have a conversation on a topic that all of them may not have encountered before.
Mhm.
So many things that I'm thinking about now. Given that, right, and your conceptualizations of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and the ways in which you have engaged in both, how do you feel that your commitment to Black studies impacts the work you do disciplinarily?
But I think it's at the level of intellectual history, it's just looking at so many artists, writers, etcetera. Weird distinctions because writers are artists, whatever. But looking at all these different people and seeing how hard they worked,
Mhm,
right? So when you have, I hate we always use him as a big example, but I do think it's pertinent. When you're looking like at Du Bois, right? He's not like dabbling in hermeneutics. He's not like dabbling in. He's doing the work actually,
mhm,
and you can see the shift across registers in that work. This is very true, particularly, frankly, I find this interesting, sort of Reconstruction era Black thought, you really see it, but I think it's on a big comeback, and that's part of what inspires me right now, which is, 1, people scholars more generally finally no, humanities critical scholars, I'll go more distinct, perhaps finally taking seriously that all kinds of other outside of a lip service sort of way, that all kinds of other Black production critically bear on a larger project of Black thought. So taking art seriously, taking it
mhm,
seriously, right? People say they do because they enjoy the objects. Like, I love talking. I mean, get so many students. I love talking about this TV show, and you're like, "Grr." It's great, but why and how and etc. Right? So they all enjoy. It's almost like stopping the arts or keeping the arts, for example, from just being like the sort of flowery dressing on the top or only being the object of analysis, right? We do suffer from that greatly. Or all scholars, humanities scholars, I think, struggle with this greatly. The idea of the critic versus the artist.
Mm-hmm.
And so what keeps me going in relation to disciplinary work in Black studies is just thinking about the long histories of people who just didn't give a shit. But it wasn't just like they were just doing stuff, sorry. It wasn't like they were just doing stuff, right? They were taking the time. So if you're looking at like a Richard Wright, for example, who has, all kinds of writing and thought and sort of informational impulses in his writing around criminology and spatial studies.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he wasn't just sort of thinking the thoughts, which can be great. You can have inspiration, it works. But at the level of disciplination, he's working with scholars. He's working with people at, Chicago School. He's working with people, in architecture. He's actually talking to those people all the time. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, again, when you really begin, you can see one of the things I really love is talking about like histories of Black intellectualism. But when you're really looking at that, if you're looking at 19th century writing, for example, in the 19th century writing of Charles Chestnut, right, or Francis Harper, they're putting so much work into understanding other fields of knowledge or various fields of knowledge that they can bring back to their writing, because their primary goal is to figure out what it's going to take, which tools it'll take, which approaches it'll take, what methods it'll take to say something important about Black life.
Mm-hmm.
And they know that there's no single tool that can get it done, right? But they also take seriously in various, sometimes complex ways, like relationships with classical education, for example, all the things. Every once in a while, you get the Black student who's interested in the classics, and they're like, "Oh God, but why the Black studies?" I'm like, we need more people trained in the classics and Black studies, because guess what? They were all trained in. The ones who
Yeah.
were like educated were trained in the classics, and it's like you can barely read Charles Chestnut without some understanding of like classical, like Greek literature. Right, because it's so peppered throughout. And it's not peppered throughout because he felt like he had to use these things to be able to be legitimate. They're just baked in. For him, like old African folk tale passed down through enslaved people is organic to him as a classical Greek story of like the Hellenic blah, blah, blah. And he's like, here we are, folks. This is who we are, right? And I think seeing that for me has always just been so deeply inspirational because it shows me that there's a payoff to all the work. That you're not doing the work to prove things to people. You're not doing the work to show that you can. You're doing the work because it's probably the only way. Because the situation of Blackness in the United States is a multivariate, insane configuration. And if you can't look at that insanity straight on, right, without some kind of humility, then I don't know what you're doing. Just saying.
Thank you. I think that was an important reminder, but also a really good, recounted, the importance of having these different knowledge funds, and that you're not going to address issues of Black people. You're not going to be able to explore these topics without having multiple tools that you can pick up.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to use a tool is more than a semester's worth of classes on that particular topic. Being able to understand it and being able to recognize it in the work that's come before, you're not going to be able to do that unless you immerse yourself in that space as well.
Yeah. And if you don't have that tool or skill set, find someone who does and take them seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And ask to be taken seriously yourself, of course. It's not like we all have to do everything. All have to do that much, but you have to make a choice to either learn it or find someone who doesn't commit to that person, commit to that project. But also remember, most of my work is in, or a lot of my work is in sort of electronic literature, game making, digital studies stuff, where you can't survive without collaboration because everything's always too big. It doesn't matter if you can even do all the parts. Almost everything's too big for one person. Mm-hmm. To get done in their lifetime, right? It just is. So you have to already go into it with such a different relationship to not just knowledge, but knowledge as labor, and also just, again, humility and a willingness to share.
Thank you. So that leads us to, which you have been talking about throughout. So if you want to say more on this, you can. If you want to feel like I've answered that question, we can move on. But what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
Yeah, again, the drive.
Mhm.
There was just because I talk all this talk about, like, the disciplines and the learning, the depth. It's I mean, did these people sleep? It's just, I'm just saying, right? Without modern conveniences, so somehow the laundry didn't get done too, right? Just saying, you know? I just think the drive and the commitment without it ever looking, 'cause still Black, not looking like desperation. I think that's part of the problem. It never looked like desperation, so it's so easy to forget about the labor.
Mm.
And then you get newer scholars, just newer meaning contemporary, meaning all of us, right, who are sitting here alive right now, who imagine that you can sort of skip steps to the outcome. And I actually don't mean in a mean way,
Yeah.
because if you don't have stories about the labor, about the intellectual production and what it took in relationships, all those things, all you see is the end product.
Mhm.
You're either gonna spend a lot of time faking it and not producing the best scholarship you could, even though it looks kinda shiny at first, or you'll spend a lot of time despairing, which is a terrible use of your intellectual and emotional energy. I'm very practical.
Do you think that that is how do you think we can make the labor more visible?
I think researching it, writing, talking about it more. I'm thinking of a talk I went to recently by Dana Williams at Howard English,
Mhm.
and she's working on a book on Toni Morrison as an editor. And it's one of those good old fashioned, which I think are the lifeblood of any field, one of those good old fashioned 10 years to write books.
Mhm.
I struggle to imagine books that don't take a very long time to write or a lot of time to write. There's other kinds of books, but you see what I'm saying, of those kinds of books, right? We need them desperately. And we'll always need them because we're always producing more scholarship in new ways, right? So we'll always need more of these books. But working on this 10-year project on Toni Morrison as an editor and really just sort of mapping out how even her own prodigious sort of output, Morrison's, is really an outcome of these relationships, right? So I think books like that, the Black Women Writers at Work book,
Mhm.
um, I'm teaching I teach a class, a graduate course on Black women's manuscript archives, which I think I'm really interested in. Like, friends, I love the book, but let's go look at the 32 drafts, literally
Yeah.
sometimes, right? Because it not only gives you insight again to, like, the pure laborness, again, the work, but it also clarifies why what is important part of what is important about the work is that the work is procedural. It's a process, not procedural, it's a
Mhm.
process, right? And so when you're looking at a manuscript archive, you're not just seeing, like, labor, 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 you're seeing someone change
Yeah.
their own minds about something, realize they were wrong, realize that by thinking more about it and writing about it, maybe they were being too harsh or too easy or they were too enamored or, whatever it
Mhm.
is, right, with their own characters, their own subjects, with anything. And I think it's very important to see that because part of seeing the labor is understanding the scholar as what we generally refer to as like a person or a human
Mhm.
versus a sort of machine that's just sort of outputting stuff according to the current taste in order to accumulate capital, etc. You can guess where I'm going, so I'll stop.
That no, that is very important, and it's interesting to think about to make that plain to students, like, you see all of the drafts, but let's also look at the changes that happened in the drafts.
Mhm.
Which I think is something particularly now that students can struggle with, like, the ability to change your mind, the ability to not be right all of the time, or to
Yeah.
learn new information and evolve your thought process and your beliefs and perspectives because you've obtained this new information. And we see these finished products from the scholars who we revere, and it's like, "Nah, but there was, like you said, a process that went into that."
Yeah.
And the first draft is not what everybody reads.
Mhm. Mhm. And that we also have to in the classroom, just thinking about wasn't your question, but how in the classroom, we also therefore have to produce structures that make that possible
Mhm.
because traditional structures of teaching generally won't. So in classes where I'm doing production stuff like, work on prototyping a video game or blah, 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 or even like, poetry and code, like those kinds of things, right? I have a deep commitment. I don't grade any final products, right? So I don't grade paper, I don't grade the cover sheet, I don't grade the game, I don't grade the code thing, anything, right? They only get graded on their process and how they talk about their process and also their peer review of each other,
Wow.
right? Because I have found, 1, peer pressure is real. So that that's a little bit it's like I'm trying to sound, like, high and noble, but also they care more about each other than they care about us, turns out, right? So they're always instilled and also, many students, if you give them the care, they care deeply. They
Yeah.
have honor and pride and brains and hearts and all the parts, right? Um, and so it takes the pressure off of producing a thing, which takes the pressure off of them producing a thing that's mainly guided by their sense of needing to perform a thing that I would like,
Mhm.
right? And I'm clear, I'm easy to be, like, sketchy as hell in class. I will never tell them I would even like. When they ask me for examples of assignments, I don't give them to them. I'm like, "Well, not give you an example," right? If I give you an example, it's what you're gonna do. Literally, you're gonna do it. I tried for years, and I was like, "This is not working," because what would happen, right? A friend of mine in my previous institution at Amherst put it really well, a colleague was saying how with smart students, or with so many students, not just smart students, 'cause they're all smart, so whether they've emerged as smart or not, to be clear. But with students, you can give them a sort of template or pattern, or even show them the outcome of how to do something, and they can do it perfectly and get as close to the A as possible according to where they are in their skills.
Mhm.
If you were asking them to take that energy, here's a topic, start from scratch, you said some really great stuff about in class about it, it's a blank stare, right? And it's not just because there's no structure and you've, like, thrown them into the deep end, but just, like, literally, you actually have to be trained into risk taking.
Yeah.
You have to be rewarded for risk taking. So what kind of structures do we produce in classes that can reward risk taking while at the same time ensuring that students, 1, know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and it also recognizes them,
Mhm.
right? So by the way, when I say I don't grade, I don't mean like I read the stuff, I look at the stuff, I have comments. To be clear, I give comments on things, right? And not only that, but I do almost all of it in person. Like I grade in person. I sit there, I'm like, let's look at this together, right? For every student, sometimes. People always joke like, "How do you have the time?" And I'm like, "They don't want to be there. Shit takes 10 minutes." You know, they take their notes, they get out as fast as they can. So it keeps me disciplined because I grade faster. Actually, um, just saying.
That would be a much quicker process.
It also means to say it and have them write it versus all the time we put into trying to, like, not break hearts with our comments or how to be clear. They
Mhm.
don't even read the comments, by the way. What you learn is they do not read the comments, right?
Yeah.
And you talk to them, they're like, I can't take it." And it's almost emotional, can't take it, right? Whatever, but babble. But my point simply is, how do we produce structures, again, that reward risk taking, that reward trying? I say one of my only classes where you get grades for trying, right? You start an A and things can happen that will whittle it away. You're not
Mhm.
trying to keep the A, you're trying to keep the A. So, yeah. So, again, that's my particular class. It can be different for you or anyone else's. My point simply is you gotta think of something because we cannot ask students, nor anyone in general, but, we cannot ask students to do things differently or to do things at a higher level if we can't actually acknowledge the extent to which structure produces the possibility for outcome.
Mhm.
Right. It's like when you're, always talking about, you see this in writing, how the students aren't going deep enough, or this is cliche and it's cliche's beginning. I'm like, if we're always asking them for the same 5-paragraph essay, guess what?
Yeah.
And a 5-paragraph essay has a value. And it has a value they should learn. You thematize it and you can move on.
Thank you. All of that was not only super interesting, but really speaks to, I think, particularly in this moment, how we want to think about the classrooms and in a moment when, what's being conveyed in the classrooms, particularly in classrooms that are Black studies or Black studies adjacent is under attack and critique, and having students really engage in the importance of the process can
Mhm.
help with reaffirming the importance of
Mhm.
having these spaces, in a way that might not be obvious to most.
Yeah. And also that, to add to that, and maybe even bluntly or too bluntly, that when you're thinking politically about the kinds of things you might want students to gain from Black studies education, not in terms of a particular politics, but, but to engage with the
Uh-huh.
world, there's all I mean, like old-fashioned sense of political, right? To sort of connect back to real world policy engagement, all the things, implementation, that you have to know how to lose. Because
Mhm.
80% of the time you will be failing and losing. And not because you did anything wrong, you just won't win. Sure.
Yeah.
And so what it takes to maintain integrity in the face of that, I think goes to what you were saying about process and goes to what you see them getting at? Like, you
Mhm.
have to actually have a belief in what you're doing and a belief in how you did it, and a way to see it, engage it, to tweak it, and to recognize yourself because you can't actually bet your feelings about yourself on outcomes because how outcomes are received is not controlled by you.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not even like you're gonna lose per se. You see what I'm getting at, though. It's just like,
Yeah.
why would you put, like, the sense of your intellectual self-esteem into a thing over which the reception of you have no control? And it doesn't mean you don't work towards audience, or work toward communities or work toward, readers, etc. But you have to have a sense of integrity. And that integrity comes from a recognition of the self and how the self does things. And
Mhm.
self in quote marks, the self can be a community or a group or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah.
Well, thank you. There are so many things that I'm thinking now, and so many important, like, reminders, but also, like, just framings that I think a lot of what you've said is really useful for framing how we think about and talk about all of these things, Black studies and the Black studies classroom and discipline and what it means to go find the person who can do the thing you can't, and the importance of community. So reaffirming the importance of community and being in community with other people is it's a necessity. It's not an option if we're going to address these questions and look at these issues and
Yeah.
acknowledge our own limitations as individuals. So given all of that, what interests you or excites you most about the present and future of Black studies?
Yeah, I think again it's the opening up and the opening up into arts, into digital, sort of text stuff I work on is also an opportunity just to work with people who I would argue are doing the work of Black intellectualism, the work of Black studies in the arts,
Mhm.
who are doing it in technology, who are doing it in engineering. I'm on a dissertation now with an electrical engineer who's thinking about sort of at the level of implementation of circuitry, already thinking about sort of the ways in which Blackness or identity is sort of infused into these systems and the real
I think I
potential
know
for
who
that.
you're talking about, and they
Mhm.
are fabulous individuals.
Right. Working on it. So, like, there's a way in which, to me, even able to say those sentences, and if this is someone for us, like in English and Blacks, if you come across, you see what I'm getting at?
Mhm.
Know about, that's huge.
Yeah.
It's actually unprecedented. Let's go big. Just saying. 'Cause not just the working with, but like we have all found each other and we knew to find each other. And this is part of the critical importance. If you look at, those kinds of moments, at some point they're very likely telling you a story about a class they had back when they were an undergrad,
Mhm.
in engineering. They got them thinking about this thing. You see what I'm getting at? And that's part of
Mhm.
the importance, right? Of the infusion of the Black intellectual tradition across syllabi, across classes, and in ways that can capture people, no matter where the outcome may lie.
Mhm.
This other thing you learn, you know this, I've definitely seen it. The outcome might be 20 years from now, it might be 10 years from now, it might be whatever. You see what I mean? So I also can't bank anything with myself on that in that way too, temporality of it. But just I think in terms of excitement, it's just the opening up, the people finding each other, the commitment that I think scholars increasingly have to making opportunities to put people in those conversations, like the centers and the programs and the grants and,
Mhm.
those kinds of things for better or for worse. If you take them seriously, that's what you can do, right? With that money and with that dispensation, it's not always money, like literally the space or dispensation or the course release,
Mhm.
whatever it is. I'm really interested, and this is just my own thing again, about, as you can tell, thinking about scholars trained in STEM in relation to Black. It's not kind of like a STEM, to be clear, like even like fetish or like they're so great or anything. Sorry, STEM, you're fine, whatever. But like, they're so great, or whatever. I just think it's a strange limb to have lopped off, right? to the configuration of what STEM is so weird and neoliberal. Like, even using the word, I'm uncomfortable. My example is always how math people are like, "Why do we have to be in this word? Like, in this, like, acronym? Like, traditionally, math is a liberal art. Like, why are we even here?" Right? We don't actually even hang sorry, this is true. They're like, "We don't" math is like, "We don't hang out with tech people." You know? We're out here trying to explain the universe. Find my beautiful proof, the poetry of the blah. I'm just saying, you know? So, like, the whole thing is a little bit of a sham that way, level of funding, but it's working. Look at them. But yeah, so I think capturing all those people who deeply care about the things we do, we being, again, Black studies, Black intellectual traditions, all those things, and giving them a real opportunity to use their very distinct skill sets in ways that we can't even conceive of,
Mhm.
right? To enable them to sort of take the wheel at times. And I think also just the reality, which I have a lot of discomfort with, particularly if we're not enabled to make these interventions, frankly, is I'm always going to be concerned about the rise of careerism. It's always there, but it's gotten worse of careerism in relation to academia,
Mhm.
college life. Because in the humanities, we can make clear points, and there's data support this around the purpose in the career per se is to make you hireable, and it works. It works on a different timeline, but it works, right?
Mhm.
Even the stuff about the sidebar, about the liberal arts people, for example, humanities people making less money. They make less money because they often make choices where they know they're going to make less money and they're willing to do it.
Yeah.
Stop, right? Because over time, we're fine. And two, in STEM, like it's true of software development, you might come at a high salary, but you're going to be at that salary the rest of your life. You will not be moving. Just saying.
Yeah.
The six figures now, the low six figures looks great, but you're going to be there 20 years from now. Understand that. Unless you make some major move and retrain yourself, go back to school and the whole thing. It was wild. You're gonna pour all the money going back to school, whatever. Just saying, shams. And so that's you know we're dragging people into financial systems and we're calling them academic systems as all. But despite that, we have to face it as a reality. And just so many students of color and so many Black students are going to end up in these majors whether they want to or not,
Yeah.
or should be or shouldn't, or should or shouldn't be, right? And I would like to feel more powerful, but it's not a thing we can necessarily stop very easily because stopping has to be at such a high level of any institution, a restructuring, again, of curricula that a large institution would never, not could never, but would take so much to even do. So we would restructure 10 different schools within an institution to get this done,
Mhm.
right? And so knowing that means that we have to produce opportunities for those students to participate in our worlds a little bit on our terms and a little bit on their terms, right? So again, so I teach classes like, digital storytelling and, data poetry, those kinds of things, like finding this place where everyone can kind of win,
Mhm.
right? Because my job isn't to make another me, to make another PhD in English. My job is to make a person who can take the work of Black studies and Black intellectualism and do something in the world with it. They end up in academia, great, hey, good luck to you, right? But my real job is about the majority,
Yeah.
not the 1 in 10 of any given year. Not even 1 in 10. The 1 in 100, 1 in 200 if you're
Yeah.
really looking, right? Terrible numbers, so I'm very practical. Right? And so thinking about that and also being a true believer in my own discipline, again, lit comp lit, around things like how do we use technologies to just help Black people better express themselves, going back to almost the Reconstruction era. So for Impulse, like how do we build new things? One, how do we build new things, not just use things that are given to us? And two, how we use them to feel better enabled or newly enabled or just newly excited
Mhm.
to talk about our life worlds, right? And I do think this is a particularly great moment for that, even though it feels kind of the opposite. It was a very keep your chin up moment, integrity, all that stuff.
Mhm.
Like, please get me out of this hole, thanks.
It's fine. Everything is fine. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you would like to add or any of your upcoming projects you would like to say anything more about?
I was thinking about that. I have a big chunk of stuff that's too, I feels babbly. Watch me fail yet again in self promotion. But I will say in general, I want the peoples of the earth, particularly in Black studies, to get more in the habit of including digital work in
Mhm.
their syllabi, in their thinking, and to do the work much less work in a discipline, but do the kinds of work you have to do to know how to talk about those projects and find those projects because they're really proliferating and they're quite isolated from the rest of Black studies, even the Black studies projects.
Mhm.
And there are directories and there are other places. There are places where people can look for them, right? But even knowing how to integrate and think about how to integrate, I mean, that's something one of our centers at Hume, Black Digital Experimental Humanities initiative that we do here does. It's just like helping you find stuff and how to talk about it, right? You make your syllabus, you do your own thing, but we can help a little bit with that. And so just thinking about getting people to think more robustly about video essays, about digital projects, about all these things are out there, about electronic dance stuff. I mean, there's people working in like robotics, choreography, and like West African dance. Like, how do you get those people into your class? You
Yeah.
see what I'm getting at? How do you integrate that
Mhm.
into your class? It's not so easy, of course, it's just saying just do it. But there are ways. And I think so instead of talking about projects, which in some way my projects are about, like, those are the things I make as well. So I have a stake clearly in this. But as much as possible, please just follow up on the promise that all the people working on these things are going to be able to actually be included in Black studies.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're only gonna be included if people ever bother to look, and getting eyes onto digital projects is still extremely difficult. People love the idea, right? But literally will never click,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that's, for me, what my mind has really been on, because as someone who's actually paid to get graduate students and faculty and community people to make these things, I don't want to feel like I'm asking them to do a thing that's gonna actually separate them out
Mhm.
from the rest of the scholarly world, right? That's maybe a little bit dramatic, but I do worry. It's like when I get hired to, like, run these digital centers and do all that stuff, but I'm like, if this is an institution, not mine per se, but, if institution X can't tenure or promote people doing digital work, then do not ask me to help
Yeah.
them with digital projects, please. Just don't, right? So it's just a lower, not lower level, but a version of that for
Mhm.
subsidy of that narrative. So again, we gotta get this upbeat. Getting a little too pragmatic, which is harder. But I think people are ready for it. And I think what we saw is a weird connection, but I think it's there. I think one of the things we saw with COVID times, high COVID times, isolation times, or I think people found it easier, maybe even forced to really see how badly we need media
Mhm.
and how badly we need different forms of storytelling and how badly and we need them. It's not just like we like them. We actually need
Yeah.
and that the same pertains to academic work, right? So I do feel like now is a particularly good moment or a moment filled with possibility historically to sort of help people shift over a bit or open their perspectives on that a little bit because ultimately, even for scholars, there has to be a side of pleasure. They have to
Mhm.
know why they're doing it. They have to want it, right? Just like anyone else. And so I think this is a moment, hopefully I'm right, where, it's possible to make that argument more effectively. That's the closest I get to upbeat, sorry.
I think that that's important too, though. And yeah, there is a lot of possibility in this moment. And there's a necessity to be able to tell those stories and elevate that work and get more eyes on it because we're in a moment where the things that we traditionally think of as scholarship are very much under attack. And the
Mm,
work of Black studies is innovation and creativity in the midst of all of that. And so we
yep.
have things to look to that are doing that now, and we should definitely do that and
Mhm.
take that more seriously.
Yeah. And the relationship between sort of, even in rudimentary ways, understanding how to enact or implement knowledge in a digital space,
Mhm.
a non-platform based, not social media place is key to Black fugitivity, which is
Yeah.
always a subset, or not a subset, but sort of overarching, MO and sort of umbrella of possibility. What does that mean? Umbrella of possibility, that enabled so much of this innovation, experimentation, and impulse, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much for your time and for your insights and all of your generous responses. I truly learned a ton and appreciated being able to talk with you today.
Thank you. That's nice to actually have to make some sense. It was really nice. I love talking to you.
Well, you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks.